Meredith Brooke Baker Belk is a Southern American poet. She is as Southern as were Eudora Welty and Flannery O'Connor, as Cornpone and Collards. Like many Southern writers, she is obsessed with the past, with traditions, with the history of people and places, with her ancestors. These obsessions give her poetry a concreteness that is, of course, essential to great poetry, a locale, a place. Great poetry creates little worlds, and we enter into these and have experiences, and these experiences have significance to us or not. And that significance is how a poem means. Another characteristic of great poetry, like Robert Frost's Directive or Denise Levertov's A Tree Telling of Orpheus, is that it almost always is didactic in the broad sense that it teaches us something important. It has something to say. You know, like truly great experiences in life. Brooke Belk is a truly great poet, in my estimation, the greatest of the Southern American poets. I first encountered Belk's poetry at a regional Burning Man festival in North Carolina called Transform Us. She showed up at a poetry reading held by the camp I was bedded down with, a lithe little thing who would have weighed maybe 100 pounds after mud wrestling. She was wearing a big pair of kick-ass hiking boots, and she read a couple of poems with the intensity and focus of a red-tailed hawk descending on a black racer snake. And the poetry was so good that it almost blew the back of my head open, as Emily Dickinson said of great poetry. One almost never encounters the like. I would not have been more astonished if I had run into the shade of Jeanne d'Arc in the hallway one morning while headed to the bathroom. One of the poems she read that day was a piece called Dire Wolves. Call this an analysis if you like. I prefer to call it paying attention. Okay. Dire wolves. Wolves don't know it either. Why the past is always bigger, or how it dies. The full story of their massive cousins, dark beasts with canines long as hands, vaulting the firelight, descending sudden as rage. After the first mandible, unearthed by accident in Indiana, we called them dirus. Merciless, terrible, cruel as Earth's first furious children. And it's true that wolf eyes, cartoon yellow, staring from book jackets, posters, an old zoo t-shirt, compel a knowledge absolute as bone. I am smaller than I think I am. My body knows the story of their hunger to pick me clean of flesh and brawn and brain, to bite open my skull, feed from it, lick the smooth white bowl until it glistens, clean as the moon, to bury it in leaves and let the slower hungers of the earth crack open what is left with cold, to scent at the place where I shatter, slowly reamed and bound by melting glacier, ground by the mountain into a fine silt, then into this, our fertile Piedmont loam. The poem begins with a couple of assertions about wolves and us. We don't know why the past is bigger. we don't know how it dies. So, both we and wolves are ignorant in these ways. Note how we are included in these statements about ignorance of the past and about the conclusive passing of the past, it dies, by means of a single word, either. This is an example of the breathtaking economy that one finds in poetry of the highest caliber. Also note that this statement about the past is a direct contradiction of the conventional wisdom, which is that it shapes and so lives on in the present. The poem is about some kinds of ignorance and conventional thinking, and is a challenge to us to push back that ignorance a bit. Okay, ever since E. E. Cummings, immature would-be poets have thought unreasonably that they could ignore the standard rules of grammar, punctuation, capitalization, spelling, etc., not having understood that Cummings was a master and broke rules for precisely calculated reasons. Poetry is language used more, not less, precisely than in prose. So good poets follow the rules. Like Cummings, break the rules for reasons and consider everything, including small matters like punctuation, carefully. The latter is due to a rule for producing great poetry or any great writing: work economically. The colon in the first line carries the weight of an entire phrase, and here is what they do not understand. Okay, let's consider the two concepts after the colon that are not, according to the speaker, understood. The material after the colon consists of two statements: the past is always bigger, and it dies, it meaning the past, each introduced by one specific adverb, the first by why and the second by how. The past is bigger in a couple of senses. One, the present is an instant, whereas the past was lots and lots and lots of instants. Modern quantum mechanics has made clear how precisely accurate this notion of instance is. Two, in the minds of contemporaries like wolves and us, things from the past are relatively impressive. It's all so bigger in the sense that things in it were larger. Velociraptors became the sparrow and the common moorhen. Dire wolves were, on average, about 25% heavier than our modern gray wolves, and at their maximum weighed around 200 pounds, about the weight of a modern refrigerator, compared to the maximum among modern gray wolves of about 175 pounds. They could be 6 feet in length and as tall as a 14-year-old human. Note that the speaker uses the present progressive, is always, emphasizing that this bigness is perception in the minds of wolves and of us. Perhaps modern wolves digging about and finding the bones of an ancient dire wolf are impressed. So, the question is, why is the past perceived as bigger? The why could be read in several ways. For example, as questioning a designer god's reasons for making it bigger. But the is always suggests that we should focus instead on the perceptions of living creatures. Why to us does it seem bigger? Similarly, the how in how it dies can be read in several ways. Two, I think, are relevant to this poem. How in the sense of the means, by what means does it die? And how in the broader sense of the manner, the nature of the dying. In what manner does the past die, and what is the means of this dying? So, these are two questions that the speaker poses at the outset. A side note, for a long time people thought that modern gray wolves were descended from dire wolves, but contemporary researchers have shown us that this is not the case. Now, the two lineages are different branches on the same tree of life and have a common ancestor. The poem makes this clear. The dire wolf is a cousin, not a grandfather or grandmother. A clarification of the question, why is the past perceived as bigger, comes in the phrase, the full story. We do not and cannot know the full story about the past. The unknown is huge. In lines 3 through 6, we get a brief description of dire wolves. They are massive, dark beasts with canines long as hands. This juxtaposition of the teeth and the human flesh of the hands is pretty terrifying. People in the past built fires for warmth, for cooking, for illuminating a setting for communal interaction via storytelling or singing or dancing, and importantly, for protection, to keep away wild beasts that might harm them in the night when they are most vulnerable. But dire wolves are so terrible, so dangerous, that they aren't deterred. In a wonderful word choice, the speaker says that they will vault the firelight, suggesting breathtaking, literally breathtaking, athletic prowess and total lack of fear. And then we get the Homeric catalog of the qualities of the dire wolf. They are dire, merciless, terrible, cruel, furious. The word furious suggests the Erinyes, the Furies, chthonic or earthborn deities from the Greek Chthon, or earth. These are demigods who take vengeance on men. Appropriately, the first body part of one of these dire creatures was a mandible, the first one found, or jaw. The poem contains this allusion to the children of earth, Gaia, and the sky, Uranus. These included the fearsome Cyclops and Hecatoncheires and Gigantes, or giants, and the 12 Titans. Uranus hated his children and imprisoned them in Gaia, or Tartarus, and this led Gaia to turn on her husband and encourage her youngest son, Kronos, or Time, to rise against his father, which he did, severing Uranus's genitals with a sickle. From the blood of this severing arose the Furies, among other demigods. Humans cannot deal with a phenomenon as terrible and merciless as dire wolves. They can't handle emotionally the perceived threat posed by simple gray wolves of the present, their smaller, less fearsome cousins, as the next stanza make clear. Humans have to reduce the gray wolf, the alien yellow of their lives, to a cartoon yellow on book jackets, posters, and old zoo t-shirts. But the attempt doesn't work. Those eyes compel, the poem says, that is force, a knowledge absolute as bone. In what sense is bone absolute? Well, it's a final thing, isn't it? When you strip away the flesh, absolute in the sense of foundational, at the base. It's also absolute in the sense that if you see your bones, you know that something absolutely serious has happened. This knowing, this knowledge, what is it? Well, it's that, according to the poem, I am smaller than I think I am. This line is a cruxus, or turning point, signaling a shift in focus of the poem from the dire wolves to the speaker in the concluding stanza, which breathtakingly reduces the person to a thingness, a meal thing upon which the wolf feeds, stripping it down. Is there a line in the English language more terrifying, more horrific than is to bite open my skull, feed from it, lick the smooth white bowl until it glistens clean as the moon? If there is a line more horrific than that, I haven't encountered it. The stanza is a kind of orgy of self-abasement, like cutting taken to the extreme. I am small. I almost long for the purity, the glistening cleanness of the moon, long a symbol of purity, of being stripped down, licked clean, and finally to be buried. But then comes the miracle of the last stanza. This thanatopsis, this death wish, is not complete. There remains this hope for resurrection, for the cold, for glaciers to grind what remains after the wolves feed down to a fine silt. And what is this silt? It is the fertile loam, rhymes with home, by the way, of the Piedmont, which is the speaker's place. We know this because of the word our. The Piedmont is a plateau region between the Atlantic alluvial plain and the Appalachian Mountains. And so the poem ends with this hope of resurrection, faith in the regenerative earth. The ending of this poem reminds me of Dylan Thomas's "And I must enter again the round Zion of the water bead and synagogue of the ear of corn." And thus we get the answers to our initial questions. Why is the past bigger? Well, it works over geological time by these incredibly slow processes to create anew. And how does it die? Well, by this slow process of grinding down in terms of its the means and manner. But it doesn't really die, does it? It is transformed. It is translated. It is reborn and renewed. It becomes that loam which gives birth to new growth. Okay, so much for explication of the poem. I would like to conclude by talking a bit about the astonishing prosody or music of this poem. Ms. Belk is not only one of the greatest poets America has produced, but is also an accomplished pianist and a singer with much training and experience and a breathtaking vocal range. And she has that essential characteristic for a poet, a keen ear for the music of this and other languages. I'm going to go down a list of examples. Consider the opening. Wolves don't know it either. A trochaic tetrameter, 3 feet of a strongly stressed syllable followed by a less strongly stressed one. Bum, 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 bum. However, in the first 2 feet, if you looked at an oscilloscope recording of those 2 feet, the second syllable would be almost as strongly stressed as the first. Why? Well, in each case, the second syllable begins or ends with an alveolar fricative, the voiced D in don't and the unvoiced T in it. These are much stronger than the relatively weak ulls of wolves and ow sound at the ends of the preceding words. This gives the effect of a number of 2 strong stresses in a row in each case. In other words, the phrase is almost a couple of initial spondees, spondee being a metrical foot made of 2 strong stresses. This has the effect of slowing the phrase down and thus emphasizing it, as one does when making an important point or calling out to a crowd. In other words, the prosody of the opening is like the what or listen up at the beginning of an Anglo-Saxon poem. What we got in year to come, as Beowulf begins. This is followed by the assonance of the P in past and the B in bigger, two sounds differing only in whether they are voiced, the P, the voiced the B, or unvoiced the P, and the alliterations of bigger and beasts, cousins, and canines. Dies is a strongly stressed syllable beginning with the naturally strongly articulated D sound, which adds to the finality of the statement. Its, its sound mirroring its sense. In full story, we get the combination of the vowel represented by the U and the liquid L, followed by the vowel sound represented by the O and the R sound, which is technically an approximate, less decisive and more open and vowel-like than the other consonants like D and T. This has the effect of drawing out the phrase full story, and again the sound echoes the sense. Note in the next line that the word vaulting itself has a vaulting sound and descending, a descending one. When saying the word vaulting, the voice tends to hesitate at the T. Vault with the ascendant, the descent, and afterthought, emphasizing the movement in both cases. Vaulting. Note the felicity of the two anapaests in unearthed by and accident, and the three anapaests in merciless, terrible, furious. Note the word internal rhymes in earth and first, and the alliteration of first and furious. Note the phonetic chiasmus, or reversal of the B and S sounds in absolute and the S and B sounds in as bone. This technique is combined with what the critic Kenneth Burke called in The Philosophy of Literary Form augmentation, in which a pair of sounds close together is followed by a pair, the same pair, further apart. This is music, folks. Note that the repetition of sounds in the line, I am smaller than I think I am. Note the repeated hard C and K sounds of pick and clean, the alliterations of brawn, brain, and bite, and of feed from. Note the repetition of the hard CK sound in clean, skull, and lick. Note the powerful repetition for emphasis of clean, pick me clean. Pick me clean, ... clean as the moon. Repeating a word in a poem is not typically a good idea, but here the repetition is masterful. Note the alliteration of leaves and let, and the internal rhymes of slower and hunger, the alliterations of crack and cold, melting and mountain, the internal rhyme of bound and ground. I could say more, but I think I'll stop there. This is masterful work, powerful, brilliantly wrought. That publishing houses are not clamoring to be the one to publish the first couple of volumes of the work of Meredith Brooke Baker Belk is a commentary, a sad commentary on the degeneracy of our culture in this age and in this time. In my estimation, she is one of the greatest poets that this country has produced, and perhaps the greatest poet writing in English in the present day. I'm going to record a couple more of her poems, and analyses of those will come.